So this is joint work with my co-authors Markus Ahlers, who is here, and Philippe von Basshuysen, also from the University of Hannover, who's not here. Yeah, so the title sort of gives it away to make sort of much clearer like what we're calling for. We need to talk about self-fulfilling prediction. Okay, so I'm going to drop a concept at you, which is performative prediction. That is a phenomenon that occurs when a predictive system, like a model, doesn't just predict, but its predictions can causally shape outcomes in the real world. All right. And there's two types of performativity that are often distinguished. The first is self-defeating performativity, where predictions cause divergent outcomes, sort of undermining their own truth or accuracy. So imagine sort of I use a model to issue a traffic prediction. It's going to be a traffic jam later down the road, right? And then I make this prediction public, and so drivers are going to avoid the route in question, and no traffic jam occurs, sort of undermining the truth of the prediction. Now, this form of performativity has received sort of a fair amount of technical attention in the ML community. However, there's been sort of very little engagement of its ethical aspects, and we don't think that's super great. But there's another issue, like a sort of larger, sort of more pernicious form of performativity, which is self-fulfilling performativity, where predictions cause their own truth. So imagine I use a model to predict that a bank is very likely to fail, right? And then in response to that, customers might panic, try to withdraw their assets from the bank, thereby causing the very sort of thing that is being predicted. And this is a sort of largely overlooked phenomenon in the ML literature, despite serious ethical implications, as we'll illustrate. So the community-wide call for action that we sort of want to present here is that we need to talk more about this kind of stuff. All right, so here is a quick sort of rundown of three sort of prominent domains where self-fulfilling performativity matters. The first is, probably quite familiar to a lot of you, recommender systems. So there is increasing evidence, as some of you might know, and awareness that especially sort of social and streaming platform recommender systems may sort of causally shape user interests, political views, and preferences over time. So you might have these sort of reinforcing feedback loops where you predict an item to be relevant for A, and then that makes A more likely to engage with that item. And from that you infer that, oh, A must actually prefer that sort of X item over other types of items, make it even more likely that you suggest those types of items to them. Okay, so some risks associated with that are, well, you might be sort of steering preferences away from something that we might understand to be sort of more authentic choices, thereby perhaps undermining people's agency, autonomy, and so on. Second domain of interest, also familiar to a lot of you, risk assessment tools in the criminal justice system, sort of Compass, for instance. So here we have a paper where we draw out sort of a concern about self-fulfilling predictions, where you issue sort of a high-risk prediction for an individual, and that is supposed to inform judicial decision makers who might decide, for instance, to sort of send them to prison rather than release them in parole. And prison isn't a great place to be, and there's a very rich sort of social science literature suggesting that being in prison sort of is going to actually increase your recidivism risk down the line, among a bunch of other things. So you can have this sort of self-fulfilling sort of causal chain between a model issuing sort of a risk assessment and it making that risk assessment come true down the line causally through this sort of like causal chain. Now, the problem with that is that suggests that rats may unjustly induce outcomes that they're meant to only predict, sort of making clear that framing these tools as mere predictive systems is the wrong way to think about them. Okay, and then finally, a third domain of interest is the use of machine learning in scientific discovery. So recently, people have become sort of quite excited to use ML systems to predict and recommend research directions to scientists, to sort of like, in the pursuit of sort of fully automated science. And the worry is that, well, if scientists follow these recommendations, well, this steers rather than just predicts research trajectories, potentially including in suboptimal ways. So some concerns are, well, you might just sort of perpetuate existing biases doing that, right? So if you train these systems on published scientific literature, right, that also need funding to be conducted, then maybe you're just a lot more likely to predict really well-funded research, right? Sort of just making research that is already very likely, even more likely to occur in the future. And that might stifle creativity, diversity, and homogenize research directions in suboptimal ways. Okay, so let me say a few words on where we think current approaches in the technical ML literature fall short in addressing this. So first, existing ML research largely focuses on self-defeating performativity and neglects self-fulfilling variance. And I think the main reason for that is that self-defeating performativity sends you an obvious error signals. Your predictions are not accurate anymore, so you have something to worry about if predictive accuracy is something that is valued in the community. Now, the tech literature sort of understands performativity as a predictor that causes a self-induced form of distribution shift. So here is a bunch of really great papers on that. And the sort of main strategy to deal with that problem is what we call endogenization, right? So the aim is sort of to try and anticipate how a real-world system responds to a prediction and to already incorporate that in your first sort of order prediction, right? To issue a prediction that is sort of stable in some form of equilibrium. Okay. Now, what's also really great about that literature, we think, is that people acknowledge that when predictions sort of steer outcomes in non-trivial ways, then, when predictions shape outcomes, predictive systems steer, right, the world rather than just predict, right? And we think that this is really sort of, nice and progressive. However, the question sort of where we should steer outcomes, towards what kinds of user engagement or preferences, what kinds of recidivism risk outcomes, or what kinds of scientific discovery trajectories, well, that's completely underdetermined, right? It is not just a technical issue, right, that we can sort of model away. It is a thoroughly ethical issue that involves, a whole bunch of familiar fact-style concerns about justice and bias, like in the criminal justice setting, transparency, responsibility, and so on and so forth. All right. So here's a rough sketch of a 3-pillar Athenian-themed research agenda that we think might help sort of do better. Okay, pillar 1 is about technical methods and tools. So we need to invest more heavily in developing a unified theoretical framework that allows us to be sort of, articulate about performativity of various forms, right? Sort of understanding and articulating sort of what the problem is in a formal language. Second, we need to develop more empirical methods to audit ML systems for performativity. And this is really tricky because self-fulfilling performativity in particular is really hard to detect empirically, right? You don't get an error signal if your predictions come out true a lot of the time. There's nothing sort of obvious that tells you like something is going wrong. All right. So across these, our suggestion is to sort of focus our efforts on causal counterfactual type analyses, sort of like thinking analytically and empirically about what would happen if the prediction had been different. And if there is a difference in outcomes with respect to differences in the prediction, then this suggests that there might be sort of problematic forms of performativity. Second pillar is about ethics research and value negotiation. So identifying the concrete values at stake in different domains, sort of agency in recommender systems or justice in the criminal justice setting, and mapping and negotiating trade-offs between competing values, right? Sort of ML engineers trying to build systems that predict well versus sort of potentially undermining individuals' agency or autonomy. And finally, the third pillar is about legal and regulatory frameworks. So here, the aim is to sort of better articulate and allocate novel responsibilities among developers, deployers, and regulators that arise when ML systems are not just sort of innocuous predictive tools that give you sort of one-way epistemic access to the world, but are performative instruments that shape the world in non-trivial ways that sort of link back to your choices as an engineer. And this is also meant to sort of address some gaps in existing regulatory framework, like the EU AI Act, for instance, remains surprisingly silent on anything that sort of, is less problematic than sort of full-on manipulation attempts, right? But sort of less intentional stuff, like, the systems that I touched on, they're not really tracked by that type of regulation. Okay, wrapping up. Key takeaway. So many predictive, sort of putatively predictive systems may not only predict, but also causally shape outcomes. This raises a bunch of urgent ethical implications. Technical solutions alone are insufficient to address these. This requires interdisciplinary collaboration, which is sort of why I'm here talking to you folks. What's needed in particular is community-wide recognition of performativity as a distinct ethical challenge and a proactive approach, sort of addressing performativity at the level of systems design and not just as an afterthought when things have already gone wrong. Now, let me also be clear that we're calling not to sort of, eliminate performativity like altogether, sort of by modeling it away, but really sort of to manage it head on with the confidence that I think, and the intellectual resources that this community has to do this well. So that's our call to action. Thank you very much for your attention. Here's a bunch of papers.